Our concluding presenter for this session will be Gerritt Van Dyk. Gerritt grew up in Northern California and then served a mission in the Korea Busan mission. Gerritt later met his wife at the BYU travel study in Nauvoo. He earned a master's in library science from Clarion University and a master's of art from BYU. Gerritt began working in the Lee Library in 2005, and currently he's the Mormon History and Doctrine librarian. So our last presentation will be the Korean translation of the Book of Mormon. Gerritt.
Well, thank you all for coming today. I am a little under the weather, which is why I've been sort of sucking back on all of that water while everyone else has been talking. I am very grateful to be here. Excuse me. It was fun to hear from Lewis and from Dr. Goodman. It's interesting to see the growth of the church in Asia. I'm going to be talking a little bit about Korea today, obviously, and before I get started, I wanted to express my gratitude, especially for their help at the Church History Library. Some of my material is from regular published material, but I also have some significant findings from the Church History Library. Scott Christensen in the back has helped me out on that. Just out of curiosity, connection to Korea. Served a mission, lived there. Great, cool. Well, let's get started. So this is a map. I figured I'd show you. I know Dr. Hessel actually did show a map of Korea also briefly. You can see here that it is sort of wedged in between Japan and China. And during that kind of reflects how it survived over the centuries. At some times it was protected by these nations, at other times it was attacked by them, either ideologically or politically. So one of the things that makes Korea wonderful, however, is in the midst of these pressures, Korea has flourished and retained an incredibly rich culture and language. From the earliest days of the Mormon tradition, translation, that is, the carrying over of meaning from one language to another, has been central to Mormonism's tenets and theology. The translation of the Book of Mormon from the gold plates was a theological sandbox for Joseph and Oliver as they experienced ancient Christianity through the words of Mormon, Alma, and Nephi. Many important Mormon ideologies can trace their origin from the Book of Mormon translation period in 1829. This continued when just a short time later Joseph began translating the Bible, with Oliver again acting as scribe. Even Mormon's abridgment of the record of the Nephites was itself a translation. For we know that the individual prophets did not write in their own vernacular, but as Moroni puts it, used Reformed Egyptian to write their history. Nephi and Mormon did not think in Reformed Egyptian. They did not speak it. They had to translate their thoughts into this foreign written language. The Gerrittites had their own language, creating yet another layer of translation, since the people of Mosiah did not know how to read their records. This accretion of translations complicates our understanding of Book of Mormon diction, idiom, and indeed authorship. My purpose today is twofold. One, to chronicle briefly the history of the Book of Mormon translated into the language of Korean and the various complications of the translation process. And two, to invite the Mormon scholarly community to consider translation studies as an important and hitherto relatively untapped facet of Mormon studies. Now, Christianity came to the Korean Peninsula in the early 16th century. You see here the Hideyoshi invasion. This is the famous invasion, actually, of Japan coming over to Korea, in which Korean Admiral Lee Sun-shin was able to defend them off using the turtle ships. Well, during this time, there was one of the generals actually was Catholic. And he brought over some Korean prisoners and had them taught Christianity. Excuse me. Well, Protestants come in the 19th century. It's interesting that the time period is very similar to what Dr. Gordon was talking about. And the Bible was finally translated into Korean by the Protestant missionary John Ross you see here pictured. So interestingly enough, Christianity comes just before 1600. And it's not until almost 1900, 300 years later, that the Koreans have a native Korean Bible. While Mormonism came to China, and it looks like Thailand, as early as 1853, and to Japan in 1901, the church did not come to Korea until just after World War II, in which Koreans were exposed initially to Mormonism through American servicemen. Once Korea was open for LDS missionaries, Mormon terminology had to be translated. As with translations of Mormon texts into other languages, there were several difficulties which immediately arose. Terms like faith, priesthood, baptism, atonement confounded translators from the earliest days of the church. Translating church materials into Korean was no different. Even the concept of a Christian God was problematic in a culture in which many scholars consider has no monotheistic religious history. Before discussing the translation of the Book of Mormon in Korean, we must first review the impact of the great Korean pioneer Kim Ho-jik, which Dr. Hessel talked about just a few minutes ago. Excuse me. Kim Ho-jik, or Dr. Kim as he came to be known, was the first documented native Korean convert to the church. In the aftermath of the Japanese occupation of Korea in World War II, Korea was decimated by a food shortage. Dr. Kim was sent by the Korean government to Cornell University, where he earned a PhD in nutritional science. It was there at Cornell that Kim learned about the LDS Church, and he decided to be baptized. And we heard a little bit about that story earlier today. Upon returning to Korea at the end of his studies, Dr. Kim became an important political figure in the country, at one point rising to Vice Minister of Education in President Syngman Rhee's cabinet. Because of his connection to the Korean government, Dr. Kim was able to personally vouch for missionaries in order to get them into Korea, something that might have taken decades without Dr. Kim's assistance. Kim was involved in translation efforts from the very beginning, having translated the Sacramental Prayers and Talmage's Articles of Faith, the very book that converted him to the gospel. Dr. Kim also translated secular books, including Darwin's Origin of Species. In May 1957, just over a year after the first missionaries were assigned to Korea, Dr. Kim was called to supervise the translation of the Book of Mormon with Chang Se-chun. You can see right here a picture of him. I'm calling this translation F1, or Fragment 1, to keep track of the various translations as we go along today. This translation, unfortunately now lost, was left incomplete when Brother Chang moved to Utah in 1959. Shortly thereafter, a second attempt was made to translate the Book of Mormon. This attempt resulted in a full translation, so it is T1, or Translation 1. Again, partnering with Dr. Kim, a new translator, Hong Byung-sik, was set apart 23 August 1959. Within just a few days, he and Dr. Kim discussed the merits of following a more elevated style, similar to the King James Version of the Bible in English. Tragically, Dr. Kim did not ever see a completed translation of the Book of Mormon. On 31 August, just 8 days after Hong was set apart, Dr. Kim died from a sudden illness. Over the next year, Hong Byung-sik worked tirelessly to complete the task assigned him. The translation process took over a year, and the editing even longer. Hong was assisted by several missionaries and Korean church members during the laborious proofreading process. The manuscript was edited and typeset at least 5 times between 1961 and 1962. Perhaps due to the lengthy changes needed to the manuscript, it was decided that only 3rd Nephi would be published, and the rest of the manuscript would be saved for further future review. Most missionaries are not even aware that this ever happened. There was only 2,000 copies of this actually printed, And fortunately, the Church History Library has a copy, and you see it depicted here. Excuse me. Just a few short months later, the Korean mission was organized with Gail Carr, one of the first missionaries sent to Korea, presiding. President Carr was just 32 years old, making him one of the youngest mission presidents in the church at the time. His wife was pregnant with their first child when he was first called. By this time, there were 5 branches and over 1,000 Korean saints. President Carr reviewed Hong's translation, T1, and found it to be somewhat antiquated and difficult to understand. The Japanese Book of Mormon had undergone a new translation just a few years before in 1957. The new edition was clearer, less archaic than the 1901 translation. In an effort to make a more accessible translation of the Book of Mormon in Korean, Carr decided to commission a new translation which would follow the new Japanese translation more closely. Elder Gordon B. Hinckley then set apart Jungdaepan as translator in April 1964. I'm calling this translation Fragment 2, F2, because it is unclear from the sources we have whether Jung completed the translation or not. In any case, we have no record of the manuscript going to print. Just before the conclusion of his time as mission president, Carr assigned one of his missionaries, Hanin Sang, to again review the previous translations and create a new translation. Han was converted and baptized in 1957. Shortly thereafter, he began his government-mandated military service. Upon returning from his time in the Korean military, he decided to put in his mission papers. Hanin Sang was the first native Korean to serve a full-time mission. He was also the first general authority from Korea. He was overwhelmed by the assignment to translate the Book of Mormon less than 8 years after becoming a member. Think about that. I'm a member for 8 years, and now I'm translating the Book of Mormon. Han was ill during this time with hepatitis, so he spent much of his time translating when his body was up to it. He consulted the Hong translation, T1, and the Jung translation, F2, the Japanese translation, and of course the English. After 6 months of translation, Han completed the manuscript in August 1965. It would take another 18 months for the manuscript to be published. Finally, in 1967, the Korean saints had a complete copy of the Book of Mormon in their native language. The Han translation of the Book of Mormon went through several editions. It was the book that thousands of Korean converts would later read. Eventually, the translation department of the church began a new translation specifically translated from the 1981 edition of the English Scriptures. This new Korean translation was published just a few years ago in 2005. With all that historical background in mind, I turn now to the second half of my presentation on some of the changes found in the 3 published Korean books of Mormon. Of the 3 translations we have copies of, it seems that Hong's translation, T1, was perhaps the most flowery and archaic, with Han's T2 focusing on transporting the meaning of difficult phrases and avoiding transliterated idiom. The most recent translation, commissioned by the church, T3, blends these 2 previous styles, sticking very closely to the English. There's no way to cover everything in 20 minutes, of course, but I will discuss a few particular examples for comparison's sake. Likewise, it is worth noting that I'm not here to critique any one translation as better or worse than another, far be it from me to presume to judge those who have embarked on a singularly spiritually and mentally taxing endeavor, the likes of which I certainly will never experience. Rather, I think it instructive to show how translation works in a theological context and the difficulties that arise from attempting something so critical to the faith of thousands. As we go through these examples, unfortunately, I will only have one verse that compares all 3 published translations, since the Home translation was only through 3rd Nephi. The first 2 references I will discuss come from earlier sections of the Book of Mormon. So the first one, 2 Nephi 3:6. So if you can see here, we've got T2 and T3 alongside the English. The idiom in question is the fruit of my loins. Even in English, this is somewhat problematic idiom. We do not use it in contemporary vernacular. Readers familiar with Elizabethan English understand it perhaps to mean something like descendants. Han, T2, translated this portion using sosan, a term that denotes the product of labor. What we in English might say is the fruit of our labors. He then used mom for body, making a transliterated version of his translation, something like the product or fruit of my body. Close to the English. T3 obviously grappled with this same problem, choosing to use the actual Korean word for fruit, 열매, but curiously pluralizing the term even when it is singular in English. The Korean word for waist, 허리, was supplied for loins, which can be an alliterative translation, albeit an old-fashioned one. In everyday Korean, 허리 means waist, a word used daily by young children and adults. The final rendering in English of the T3 version would be something like fruits of my waist or loin. Excuse me. The pluralizing may have been due to the English loins, but since none of us have more than one waist, it was removed from 허리, waist, and added to fruit. All right, so our next example is what inspired the title of my paper, Feasting on the Word of Christ. In a very famous passage of the Book of Mormon, the prophet Nephi uses this idiom to describe the correct behavior one must have in one's efforts to endure to the end. Like the lofty fruit of my loins, this figure of speech, feasting on the word of Christ, is somewhat nebulous. Believers tend to interpret this phrase as something close to studying the scriptures and words of the prophets regularly and with great relish. No pun intended. There is a very significant difference in T2 and T3 here. Han struggled with this. It is not unreasonable to think that he may not have had any idea what to do with this term. I'm certain that a lot of to it. In cases like these, translators will resort to the vernacular Bible to see how similar language was translated before. However, the only times in the KJV mentions the term feast are as a noun, such as feasts and holy festivals. Nowhere does it use the term as a verb, as Nephi does. Without a usable term to use as a reference, Han decided to translate the feeling of the idiom into Korean. You can see the result. A rough English translation of his phrase would look something like joyfully keeping the word of Christ. Keeping, in this case, something similar to keeping the word of wisdom or keeping the Sabbath day holy. T3 has this same passage read, feasting upon the word of Christ. That would be the English translation of what they have, using a decidedly Korean combination of 흡족하다 and 취하다, sufficiently or abundantly taking or eating. So for our last one, the final passage is from 3rd Nephi, so I'll be able to look at all three published editions of the Book of Mormon. And this one, the common phrase found throughout the Book of Mormon, led away the hearts. Or lead away the hearts, sorry. In T1, Hong translates this into something like, in this way, Satan tempted the hearts of the people, using the verb tempt. Hong chooses a simple image, easily understood. In T2, Han chooses instead to use the term capture, which may be from examining 1 Kings 8:48. The 1957 Korean Bible uses the same verb, 사로잡다, which is captive or to capture, which to have here lead, and in the Bible it says which led them away captive. T3 deals with this by using a different verb that connotes a pulling or grasping, and thus Satan drew out or drew away the hearts of the people. Now, with all that having been said, as I mentioned, there's much more that could be done in Mormon translation studies. Using the Studies in Mormon History database, which is perhaps the most comprehensive index of periodicals and monographs related to Mormon history, I discovered a great discrepancy in the treatment of translation studies in Mormon historical scholarship. You can see here, of the 201 citations related to translation of Scripture found in the database, fully 178, or almost 87% of the citations, were about Joseph Smith's translations of either the Book of Mormon, the Bible, or a section of the Pearl of Great Price. Only 27 articles have been written or monographs have been written about the translation process into languages other than English. I bring this up today as evidence that the field of translation studies in Mormonism is wide open. To use another scriptural idiom, the field is white, all ready to harvest. Thank you.